This is a story of a woman who is lost in the illusions of love, or what she thought was love. Emily, a vibrant 19-year-old with dreams of a future filled with possibilities, met Edward when she was at a crossroads in her life. She had just graduated high school, unsure of what path to take next. Edward, at 75, was a man of power, wealth, and charm. His age was just a number, he would say, and he appeared to have everything figured out. To Emily, his world seemed like the one she had been waiting for: grand homes, expensive vacations, and a life of luxury. When he smiled at her with that knowing glint in his eyes, she was enchanted. It didn't matter that there was a 56-year age gap between them. In his world, age was irrelevant, and she believed him. She had nothing to lose. He swept her off her feet, telling her that he could offer her the life she always dreamed of. For Emily, it felt like a dream come true. At first, everything was perfect. Edward showered her with lavish gifts, took her to the best restaurants, and made her feel like the center of his universe. He made her feel important in a way no one ever had. The way he spoke to her, always with attention, always with adoration, convinced her that she was more than just a pretty young face. Edward was, to her, a Prince Charming who would provide everything she needed. But soon, the reality of their relationship began to sink in. It was subtle at first, like small cracks in an otherwise perfect facade. It was the way Edward would look at her, sometimes with a coldness that made her feel insignificant. It was the comments he would make under his breath about how she could dress better or behave differently. She attributed it to his age, thinking perhaps his expectations came from a different time, a time when women were expected to be more reserved, more polished. But these small remarks soon grew into something more. Edward, despite his wealth, was a man who had never learned how to truly love. He had spent his life accumulating riches and power, but never had he invested in building emotional connections with anyone. Emily soon realized she was nothing more than a trophy to him, a decoration to accompany him to social events, someone to show off to his colleagues, friends, and family. It became increasingly clear that he only saw her for her beauty and youth. Emily, who had once been confident, started to feel as though she was slowly losing herself. The compliments that had once made her glow now felt empty, meaningless. "You're stunning, Emily," he'd say with a smile, but his words no longer made her heart flutter. Instead, they made her feel like an object, a beautiful object, yes, but one that could easily be replaced. It wasn't just about physical appearance anymore. Edward began to dictate what she could and could not do. The first time she went out with her friends without him, he gave her a long lecture. He accused her of being careless and irresponsible for spending time away from him. "You should be with me, not them," he scolded her. Emily, perplexed, tried to explain that she had her own life, her own desires, but his dismissive glance told her all she needed to know. "Your life is here with me now," he said coldly. "Don't forget who gave you the life you have." Those words stung. But at the time, Emily thought they were coming from a place of care. She convinced herself that he was just looking out for her, trying to keep her safe. After all, he had more life experience than she could ever imagine. But deep inside, a small voice began to whisper, questioning everything. Was she really happy? Was this the life she had imagined for herself? The first significant moment of doubt came when Edward told her she needed to cut ties with her family. "They're not your future, Emily," he said, his voice dripping with authority. "I am your future. The sooner you accept that, the better." She froze at his words, unsure of how to respond. He had given her everything, his love, his support, his home, but it felt as though he was slowly taking away her freedom, piece by piece. He didn't want her to be her own person. He wanted her to be only what he allowed her to be. The worst part, though, was when he stopped listening to her altogether. Emily tried to talk to him about her fears, about how she felt like she was losing herself in their relationship. She longed for someone to see her for who she was beyond her appearance. But Edward had no interest in her thoughts or feelings. He was too busy with his business, too busy with his own world to care about her emotional needs. He dismissed her concerns with a wave of his hand, telling her to be grateful for what she had. "You'll never find another man who can give you what I've given you," Edward would remind her. You should be thankful." It wasn't long before the cruelty became more evident. Emily began to feel suffocated by his presence, trapped in his expectations. When they went to social gatherings, he would introduce her as his young wife, as though she was merely an accessory to him, a way to boost his own ego. His comments about her beauty began to feel more like criticism. He'd say things like, "You're gaining weight, Emily. Do you think men will look at you the same way when you're not so young?" Her confidence, once radiant, began to erode. She tried to keep up with his demands, trying to be the perfect wife in his eyes, but it was never enough. No matter how much she changed, no matter how hard she tried to make him happy, it seemed to make no difference. She was always falling short, always feeling inadequate. And then there was the loneliness, the crushing loneliness. She was surrounded by opulence, by luxury, but she felt more isolated than ever. Edward, though present physically, was emotionally absent. He would sit across from her at dinner, his mind elsewhere, his attention focused on something, anything, other than her. Emily realized that, despite all the material wealth, she was starving for emotional connection. She felt invisible, alone in a marriage that promised everything but gave her nothing of substance. She had become a shadow of herself. The most painful part was that she didn't know how to escape. She had no friends to turn to. Her family was distant, and Edward had alienated her from anyone who might offer support. Emily felt trapped in a gilded cage, unsure of how to break free from the man who controlled every aspect of her life. And then, one night, when she was sitting in the silence of their mansion, tears silently falling down her cheeks, she realized something important. She was worth more than this. She had to believe that there was something better out there for her, that she deserved more than to be treated like an object. But the fear of being alone, of not having the comfort of Edward's wealth, kept her from taking action. She knew she was at a crossroads. Her soul ached for freedom, for the chance to rediscover who she was, but her fear of rejection, of failure, kept her paralyzed. Would she ever find the courage to take that first step? Would she ever have the strength to break free from the chains Edward had wrapped around her heart? As the days went on, the whispers of doubt grew louder. You are worth more than this. You are not just a pretty face. You deserve real love. And though she didn't yet have the strength to leave, Emily made a vow to herself that she would someday find a way to break free from Edward's grasp. She would rediscover who she was, and in doing so, she would reclaim her life, her happiness, and her future. As the months passed, the small cracks in Emily's life began to widen, and she found herself sinking deeper into a place she never imagined she would end up. The promises of love and security that Edward had made her were starting to feel like chains, heavy and suffocating. At first, Emily had convinced herself that the occasional harsh comment or controlling behavior was just part of who Edward was, a man of his time, with a powerful sense of entitlement and control. But as time went on, the small inconveniences she once overlooked grew into an overwhelming weight, dragging her spirit further down with every passing day. Edward, as it turned out, was not the man she thought he was. He was not a caring husband, nor was he a loving partner. He was a man who, despite his wealth and charm, had never known how to truly love another person. His affection was conditional, based solely on her obedience, her beauty, and her ability to cater to his needs. It had become clear that he didn't value her as a person, but rather as an accessory, a beautiful, young woman who was there to feed his ego and serve as a symbol of his success. One evening, after a particularly exhausting day, Emily found herself staring at her reflection in the mirror. The woman she saw was unrecognizable. Her once radiant face had become weary, her eyes dull, haunted by the constant emotional turmoil she endured behind closed doors. She had tried so hard to be the perfect wife, to make Edward proud, to be the woman he wanted her to be. Yet, no matter how much she changed, how much she tried to meet his every expectation, it was never enough. Nothing she did seemed to matter. One day, Edward snapped at her over something trivial, her choice of clothing for an event they were attending. "You look ridiculous in that dress, Emily," he hissed, his words sharp and biting. You should know better by now. I can't have you looking like that in public." The harshness of his words cut deeper than she ever anticipated. Her heart clenched, and she fought to hold back tears. She had once been confident in her own skin, but Edward had chipped away at her self-esteem until it was barely a shadow of what it had been. She had tried so hard to fit into his world, to become the perfect woman he envisioned, but the more she tried, the more he rejected her. The sense of rejection wasn't just limited to his cruel comments. It was also in the way Edward would ignore her needs, both emotional and physical. He no longer looked at her with the adoration that had once filled his eyes. The spark had gone out, replaced by indifference and neglect. At first, Emily tried to talk to him about it. She tried to tell him how lonely and neglected she felt, how she longed for his affection, for his attention. But every time she attempted to express her feelings, he brushed her off as though her pain was insignificant. "You're being ridiculous, Emily," he would say, dismissing her emotions as if they were nothing. "What more do you want from me? You should be grateful for the life I've given you." His words echoed in her mind long after they were spoken, and she began to believe them. What more did she deserve, after all? She had everything she could want: money, luxury, status. Yet she felt hollow, like a shell of a person. The more she tried to fill the emptiness with material things, the emptier she felt inside. As the days went on, Emily's world became smaller and smaller. Edward's control over her life intensified. He started to limit the time she spent with friends, accusing her of neglecting him. He would give her cold stares whenever she suggested spending time away from him, and he would often guilt-trip her into canceling plans to stay by his side. "You're mine now," he would remind her, his voice cold and possessive. "You should be here with me, not out there with your friends. You don't need them anymore." The isolation was suffocating. Emily began to feel more and more trapped, as though her every move was being monitored and scrutinized. She couldn't remember the last time she had truly laughed or felt free. Her life had become one long, monotonous routine of pretending to be someone she wasn't, pretending to be the perfect wife for a man who didn't even care to see her for who she really was. But the worst part wasn't the isolation or the constant rejection. The worst part was the emotional toll it took on her sense of self. Edward's words, though hurtful, became more and more powerful with each passing day. He had managed to convince her that she was nothing without him, that she would never find anyone who could love her the way he did. She had believed his lies for so long that she had started to lose sight of who she truly was. She had become so focused on meeting his expectations that she forgot what it was like to be herself. Every time she tried to stand up for herself, to challenge his cruelty, he would put her down even further, twisting her words and making her feel like the problem was always with her. "You're just too sensitive," he would say. "No one else would ever put up with you. You should be thanking me every day for being with you." Emily had become a prisoner in her own life, a prisoner of her own fear. She was afraid of what would happen if she spoke up, if she stood up for herself. Would Edward leave her? Would he make her life even more unbearable? The thought of losing him, of losing the life she had come to rely on, terrified her. But deep inside, there was a voice that told her this wasn't the life she deserved. She was worth more than this. As the months passed, Emily's internal conflict grew. She couldn't ignore the pain any longer. The more she tried to conform to Edward's expectations, the more she felt herself slipping away. She was losing her sense of identity, her sense of worth. She had become a mere reflection of the woman Edward wanted her to be, not the woman she had once been, a strong, confident, and independent young woman with dreams of her own. She had let those dreams fade, one cruel comment at a time. One afternoon, as she walked through the mansion they called home, she saw herself in the reflection of a window. She barely recognized the woman staring back at her. She was thinner, paler, and her eyes were filled with a sadness she had never known before. The woman in the mirror looked as though she had given up, and it terrified her. What had she become? She wondered. How had she allowed herself to get to this point? That was when it hit her. She had lost herself. In trying to please Edward, in trying to be what he wanted, she had lost sight of who she truly was. She had forgotten the person she had once been, the confident, free-spirited young woman who had dreams and hopes for the future. That woman was still inside her, buried deep beneath the weight of Edward's cruelty and neglect. But was it too late to find her again? Emily didn't know the answer yet, but one thing was certain. She couldn't continue living like this. She couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine when her heart was breaking. It was time to make a decision. She knew she couldn't stay in this toxic, suffocating environment any longer, but the fear of rejection and the uncertainty of what would happen next kept her paralyzed. She longed for the courage to take that first step, to reclaim her life and her self-worth.
But how?
Where could she possibly go from here? The internal battle raged within her, but one thing was clear. She needed to find a way out. Emily's heart felt as though it were being crushed under the weight of her own fear. Every moment in Edward's presence seemed like an eternity, each passing day growing darker and more suffocating. The world she had once thought was a dream had turned into a nightmare, and every inch of her soul screamed for escape. She had tried, time and time again, to ignore the deep ache that resided within her chest. But the cracks in her spirit had spread too far, and there was no way to deny it any longer. She was dying inside. Despite the isolation, despite the emotional abuse, Emily still clung to the idea of being loved by Edward. In a way, she had convinced herself that if she just tried harder, if she just gave him more of herself, more of her time, more of her soul, he would see her. She still hoped, deep down, that the man who had once swept her off her feet could change. But each time she tried to talk to him, each time she tried to reach out, he pushed her further away, making her feel smaller, weaker, and more insignificant. His indifference had turned into cold cruelty, and yet, she couldn't break free. The breaking point came on a cold winter evening. Edward had invited a few of his wealthy friends over for a dinner party. Emily had spent hours getting ready, choosing the perfect dress, styling her hair, and applying makeup with a hope that maybe, just maybe, this would be the evening when Edward would see her again. The woman he had once admired, the woman he had once claimed to love. When they arrived at the party, Edward barely acknowledged her. He introduced her to his guests, but his words were empty, and his gaze never lingered on her. She stood there, smiling politely, the weight of his neglect pressing down on her chest. She felt as though she were invisible, a ghost in a room full of people who didn't care, least of all Edward. Hours passed in a blur. Edward engaged in lively conversation with his friends, talking about business deals, politics, and matters that held no interest for her. She stood at his side, smiling when necessary, but feeling more alone than ever. The laughter and chatter around her only amplified the hollow emptiness inside her. It wasn't just that Edward ignored her. It was that she had lost herself in his world, and now, she didn't know how to find her way back. At one point, she excused herself from the group and stepped out onto the balcony for a breath of fresh air. The cold wind bit at her skin, but it was a welcome relief from the suffocating heat of the house. She leaned against the railing, her mind swirling with thoughts of what had gone wrong. How had she ended up here? How had she allowed herself to become nothing more than a prop in Edward's life? Her phone buzzed in her pocket, snapping her out of her thoughts. She took it out and saw a message from her mother. "Emily, I'm so sorry I haven't heard from you.
I'm worried about you.
Please call me." Tears welled up in her eyes as she read the message. Her mother had been trying to reach her for months, but Emily had pushed her away. She had been too ashamed to admit the truth, too ashamed to tell her family how much pain she was in, how empty she felt. But now, standing on the balcony, the reality hit her with full force. She had isolated herself. She had pushed everyone away, all in the name of a relationship that had only left her broken. She quickly typed a reply, her fingers trembling. "I'm so sorry, Mom. I don't know. I feel lost. I don't know what to do." Before she could send it, Edward's voice interrupted her thoughts. "Emily, what are you doing out here all alone?" he asked, his tone sharp and dismissive. She wiped away a tear before turning to face him, trying to compose herself. "Just getting some air," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She didn't want to talk about how she felt, not with him. Not anymore. Edward stepped closer to her, his eyes scanning her face, as though trying to assess her reaction. "You're embarrassing me in front of my friends," he said, his voice low and filled with venom. "You look pathetic. What is it now? What's your problem?" Her heart sank. She had expected the usual criticism, but this time, it hit her differently. It felt like a slap to her face. Every word he spoke seemed designed to break her, to remind her that she was nothing, that she was worthless. The tears she had been holding back threatened to spill over. I'm not your doll to control, Edward," she said, her voice shaking, though she refused to look away. "I'm not here for your amusement. I'm a person. I have feelings. I can't keep pretending that everything is okay when it's not." Edward's eyes narrowed, his face twisting with disdain. "You're so ungrateful, Emily," he sneered. "You don't understand the life I've given you. You've been spoiled by everything I've done for you. And this is how you repay me? With this nonsense." Her stomach churned at the venom in his words. She felt as though she were suffocating, drowning in the suffocating grip of his manipulation. She had tried so hard to be what he wanted, and yet it was never enough. Nothing she did, nothing she said, could make him love her. She had spent so much time trying to earn his approval, trying to gain his affection, that she had forgotten what it felt like to be loved for who she was. To be seen. To be enough. But that moment, as the cold wind whipped around her and Edward's harsh words echoed in her mind, something inside her snapped. She couldn't do this anymore. She couldn't live like this, pretending to be someone she wasn't, trying to please a man who would never see her for who she truly was. For the first time in months, Emily felt something stir within her, a flicker of strength, a spark of hope. She wasn't weak. She wasn't invisible. She wasn't a toy to be discarded when she no longer served a purpose. She turned to Edward, her eyes filled with determination. "I don't want this anymore. I don't want you. I don't want your life. I deserve more than this." Edward's face twisted in confusion, then anger. "You think you can leave me? You think anyone else will want you? You'll never find someone like me. No one will ever love you like I do." His words stung, but Emily stood her ground. She had heard enough. This was it. She wasn't going to let him control her anymore. She wasn't going to let him keep breaking her, piece by piece. "I don't care," she said, her voice steady now. "I don't need you. I never did." Edward stared at her, his face a mask of fury. "You'll regret this," he spat, his voice venomous. "You'll come crawling back." Emily took a deep breath, her heart pounding in her chest, but this time, it wasn't out of fear. It was because she was finally free. For the first time in so long, she felt a surge of power that she had forgotten she had. She had taken the first step. She was walking away from the man who had destroyed her sense of self. And she wasn't looking back. As she turned and walked away, Edward's voice called out to her, but she didn't flinch. She didn't turn around. For the first time, she was standing up for herself. She was choosing to be free. The hardest part was over. Now it was time for her to rebuild, to rediscover who she was, to embrace the woman she had lost. And she would never let anyone take that away from her again. The days after Emily left Edward felt like a blur, each moment filled with a whirlwind of emotions, both painful and freeing. For the first time in what felt like forever, she was alone, truly alone. The silence of her apartment was deafening, but there was something comforting about it, too. No more angry outbursts. No more constant criticism. No more pretending to be someone she wasn't. But there was also the crushing realization of how long she had spent in that toxic relationship, how much of her life had been consumed by Edward's manipulation and control. She had lost herself completely. Emily spent the first few days in a daze. She had no idea where to begin her journey to healing, or even how to start picking up the shattered pieces of her life. She had spent years trying to make Edward love her, trying to be what he wanted her to be, and in doing so, she had lost touch with the woman she had once been. The strong, independent young woman who had dreamed of a life full of love, adventure, and purpose seemed like a distant memory. But she refused to let that memory die. As the days turned into weeks, Emily began to take small steps toward reclaiming her life. She found herself spending hours in front of the mirror, not out of vanity, but because she needed to see herself again. She needed to remind herself that she was still there, that she was still worthy of love and respect. It was hard at first. She didn't recognize the woman who stared back at her. The bruises were invisible now, but they were still there, deep inside her. The damage Edward had done to her soul couldn't be erased with a smile or a change of clothes. One afternoon, Emily decided to go out for a walk. The weather was warm, and the sun felt like a much-needed balm against the lingering coldness in her heart. As she walked through the park, the sound of children playing and the laughter of families filled the air. She felt a pang of longing, but not for Edward. She longed for a simpler life, for a time when she could just enjoy the small things, when her happiness didn't depend on someone else's approval. It was during that walk that she saw him, a man sitting alone on a bench, reading a book. He had a quiet, peaceful presence, and something about him caught Emily's attention. She couldn't explain it, but there was something different about him. He wasn't like Edward, full of arrogance and entitlement. This man had a warmth about him, a calmness that drew people in. She hesitated for a moment, unsure of whether to approach him. She hadn't allowed herself to even think about dating again, let alone open her heart to someone else. But something inside her whispered that this was a moment she needed to embrace. With a deep breath, she walked toward the bench and took a seat nearby, carefully keeping her distance. The man looked up, his eyes meeting hers. He smiled warmly, not in the way Edward would have, with a sense of ownership, but with genuine kindness. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" he said, his voice soft but clear. Emily nodded, her heart skipping a beat. She wasn't sure what to say. It had been so long since anyone had spoken to her like this, with such simplicity and warmth. "Yes, it is," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. She didn't know why she felt compelled to talk to this stranger, but something about the way he spoke made her feel safe, something she hadn't felt in so long. For the next hour, they talked. About nothing in particular, just small talk, books, music, their lives. The conversation flowed easily, and for the first time in ages, Emily felt like herself again. She laughed, she smiled, and she felt a flicker of hope that she hadn't felt in years. The man's name was Daniel, and he was kind, intelligent, and, most importantly, he listened to her. For once, she wasn't the invisible woman in the room. She was seen, valued, and respected. As the conversation came to an end, Daniel stood up and smiled at her. "It was really nice talking to you, Emily. I'm glad we met." Emily smiled, her heart lighter than it had been in so long. "It was nice talking to you, too." They exchanged numbers, and as she walked away, Emily felt a strange sense of peace settle over her. She hadn't expected to meet anyone so soon, especially not someone who made her feel so comfortable, so at ease. She hadn't realized how starved she had been for genuine human connection until she had experienced it again. Over the next few weeks, Emily and Daniel talked regularly, getting to know each other better. Daniel was patient, never rushing her, never pushing her to talk about anything she wasn't ready to share. He respected her boundaries, and that in itself felt like a small miracle. With every conversation, Emily felt a little more like herself. She started to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could love again, not out of desperation, not to fill the void left by Edward, but because she deserved to be loved for who she was. But as Emily began to feel more at ease with Daniel, a shadow of doubt still lingered in the back of her mind. She wasn't ready to trust completely, not yet. Edward's betrayal had left scars deeper than she realized, and while she longed for a new beginning, part of her feared being hurt again. But Daniel was different. He was kind, gentle, and most importantly, he never made her feel less than. He allowed her to take things at her own pace, and in doing so, he slowly began to chip away at the wall she had built around her heart. It wasn't long before Emily decided it was time to confront her past, to look squarely at the wounds Edward had left behind, and begin the painful process of healing. She knew she couldn't move forward until she fully let go of the person who had hurt her, who had manipulated and broken her down. But she also knew that forgiveness didn't mean reconciliation. She didn't need Edward in her life anymore. She didn't need his cruelty or his judgment. What she needed was to forgive herself for allowing herself to stay in that toxic relationship for so long. She needed to accept that she had been deceived, that she had trusted the wrong person, but that didn't mean she had failed. It meant she had learned. One evening, as Emily sat in her apartment reflecting on everything she had been through, she realized just how far she had come. The woman who had once been desperate for Edward's approval, the woman who had clung to the hope of his love, was gone. In her place was a woman who had rediscovered her own worth, who had learned to love herself, to respect herself, and to value herself above all else. She wasn't perfect and she wasn't healed completely, but she was on the right path. And that path, Emily knew, was leading her to a life she had never imagined possible, a life full of love, self-respect, and, most importantly, freedom. The journey wasn't over yet, but Emily was no longer afraid of what the future held. She had learned to trust again, not because she had forgotten her past, but because she had finally learned to let go of it. And that was the first step toward true healing. No one would ever control her again. She was free. As time passed, Emily's life began to take on a rhythm she hadn't known in years. Her days were filled with small, yet significant, moments of joy. She had made a pact with herself to embrace every opportunity to heal, to grow, and to rediscover the woman she had once been before Edward had come into her life. The walls she had built around her heart, once unbreakable, were slowly coming down. With every new connection, with every moment of peace, she reclaimed a piece of herself she thought she had lost forever. Her friendship with Daniel blossomed into something even more beautiful than she had anticipated. They spent countless hours together, walking through the park, having coffee at quiet cafes, and sharing stories of their lives. Daniel was patient, never rushing her, and through him, Emily learned what it truly meant to feel safe with someone. His kindness was a balm to the wounds Edward had inflicted upon her soul, and with each passing day, Emily felt more and more confident that she was ready to love again, not in the desperate, clingy way she had with Edward, but in a way that felt free and genuine. But as the bond between Emily and Daniel deepened, Emily still couldn't shake the nagging voice in the back of her mind. Despite all of Daniel's kindness, despite how comfortable she felt around him, a small part of her still feared what would happen if she allowed herself to fall for him. Would it be enough? Would she ever truly be able to trust him completely? Or would she end up repeating the same mistakes that had led her into Edward's arms in the first place? One afternoon, after a long walk through the city, Emily and Daniel found themselves sitting on a bench by the river, the golden light of the setting sun casting a warm glow over everything around them. It was one of those rare moments in life where everything seemed to be in perfect balance, and Emily couldn't help but feel a sense of peace that had eluded her for so long. "This feels nice," Emily said, her voice soft as she gazed out at the rippling water. Daniel smiled, his eyes filled with an unspoken understanding. "It does," he replied. "I've been thinking about how far you've come, Emily. You've been through so much, and I can't even imagine how difficult it's been for you. But you're here now. You're stronger than you know." Emily smiled, but there was still a sadness in her eyes, a sadness that she couldn't quite shake. "I don't feel strong," she admitted, her voice trembling slightly. "Some days, I feel like I'm still so broken. Like I'm still trying to put all the pieces of myself back together." Daniel reached out and gently placed his hand over hers, offering her a sense of comfort and reassurance. "You don't have to be perfect, Emily. You're healing. That's what matters." Emily looked down at their joined hands, a warmth spreading through her chest. Daniel's touch was gentle, steady, and in it, she found a sense of calm. It wasn't overwhelming. It wasn't forceful. It was exactly what she needed, someone who was there, simply present, without expectation. But even with his kindness, Emily couldn't help but wonder if she was ready to fully open her heart to him.
Could she?
Was she ready to take that leap of faith and let herself be vulnerable again? Her thoughts were interrupted when her phone buzzed in her pocket. She fished it out and saw a message from an unknown number. Her heart skipped a beat as she read the message, and a wave of dread washed over her. It was from Edward. "I've been thinking about you, Emily. I want to talk. Let's work things out. I miss you." Her hands began to tremble as she stared at the message. The familiar feeling of fear and anxiety rose within her, as though she were being pulled back into the darkness she had fought so hard to escape. She hadn't heard from Edward in weeks, and she had hoped he would stay out of her life for good. But now, his words felt like a cruel reminder of the past she was trying so desperately to leave behind. Daniel noticed her sudden shift in energy and gently squeezed her hand. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice full of concern. Emily nodded, her throat tightening. She didn't want to show weakness, not to him, not now. "It's nothing. Just some old memories coming back." But Daniel wasn't fooled. He tilted his head, his eyes searching hers, and she couldn't bring herself to hide the truth. "It's Edward, isn't it?" She let out a shaky breath, nodding reluctantly. "Yes. He wants to talk. He says he misses me." Daniel didn't say anything at first, but Emily could feel the weight of his silence, as though he were carefully choosing his words. Finally, he spoke, his voice steady and calm. "Emily," he said gently, "you've come so far. You've worked so hard to get to this place, to reclaim yourself. Don't let him drag you back into that dark place. You deserve better than that. You deserve someone who respects you, who cherishes you, not someone who manipulates you and tries to control you." The words hit her like a wave, and for a moment, she felt as though her entire world was spinning out of control. Edward's message had sent her spiraling, and the fear of falling back into his web of lies and deceit threatened to overwhelm her. But as she listened to Daniel's words, something inside her clicked. She wasn't the same person who had left Edward's house all those weeks ago. She wasn't the same fragile, lost woman who had clung to a hope that Edward could change. She had learned to trust herself again, to listen to her own heart, and what her heart was telling her now was clear. Edward was part of her past, and he had no place in her future. With a deep breath, Emily typed a reply to Edward's message, her fingers shaking as she pressed the keys. "I don't need to talk to you, Edward. I've moved on. I'm done." She hit send, and a sense of finality washed over her. It was over. She was done letting him control her, done allowing him to take up space in her mind and heart. She had taken the first step in healing, and now she was taking the second, letting go of the man who had hurt her so deeply. As the message sent, Emily looked at Daniel, her heart swelling with gratitude. He hadn't pressured her. He hadn't tried to make her feel guilty or ashamed. He had simply been there for her, offering support and understanding when she needed it most. In that moment, she realized something profound. She didn't need to run back to Edward, and she didn't need to let him keep stealing her peace. She was strong enough now to stand on her own. And more importantly, she was ready to build a future that was free from the shackles of the past. Daniel smiled at her, his eyes full of warmth and kindness. "I'm proud of you, Emily," he said quietly. "You're stronger than you think." She smiled back, feeling a weight lift from her chest. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she felt hopeful. She was taking control of her life again, and she would never let anyone take that from her. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the river, Emily knew one thing for certain. She was ready for the next chapter. The past was behind her, and the future was hers to shape. As the weeks went by, Emily's world began to feel like a different place. The sense of liberation she had been craving for so long finally settled within her. The burden of her past, the toxic relationship with Edward that had weighed heavily on her, was slowly fading into the distance, no longer holding her hostage. She found peace in the everyday moments that had once seemed so insignificant. A quiet morning coffee, a phone call with a friend, the gentle sound of raindrops on the window pane. It was the simplicity of life that now brought her comfort. For the first time, Emily realized that the joy she had been seeking all along was never found in someone else's approval or validation, but in her own acceptance of who she was. She had come so far, and it was impossible to deny how much her life had changed. Daniel had become a constant presence in her life, and though their relationship had started as a friendship, it had slowly evolved into something more. They had begun dating, but Emily still carried the weight of her past with her. There were times when the old fears crept in, the fear that she would be hurt again, the fear that she wasn't worthy of love, that the man she had so carefully chosen might one day betray her just as Edward had done. The scars from her past were still visible, no matter how much she had tried to move on. One evening, as Emily and Daniel sat in a cozy restaurant, their usual easy conversation began to falter. Daniel had noticed the subtle shift in her demeanor, how her eyes no longer sparkled with the same carefree joy they once had. He could sense her walls still up, and he wasn't sure how to help her tear them down. He cared for her deeply, but the lingering doubts in Emily's heart made him feel as if they were constantly standing on the edge of something fragile. "Emily," Daniel began gently, placing his hand over hers, "I know things haven't been easy for you. I can see that you're carrying a lot, and I want to help you carry it if you'll let me." Emily met his eyes, her heart heavy with emotion. The truth she had been avoiding for so long felt like it was finally rising to the surface. She had spent so much time building herself back up that she had never fully faced the damage that still lingered deep inside her. It wasn't just the betrayal of Edward, it was everything that had led her to that point. The years of self-doubt, the toxic relationships, the constant feeling of not being enough. The emotional scars from her past were still there, and they were preventing her from fully embracing the future she longed for. "I'm scared, Daniel," she confessed quietly, her voice trembling slightly. "I'm scared that I'll never be able to trust anyone again. I'm scared that no matter how hard I try, I'll always be broken inside." Daniel squeezed her hand, his voice soft yet firm. "You're not broken, Emily. You've been hurt, but that doesn't mean you're broken. It means you're human, and you've been through hell. But you're still standing. You're still here. And that's something to be proud of." His words hit her like a wave, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Emily allowed herself to feel the weight of everything she had been through. She had never fully acknowledged the depth of her pain, always pushing it aside in the hopes that it would simply disappear. But it hadn't disappeared. It had been with her all along, quietly festering beneath the surface. She closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. "I don't know how to move past it, Daniel. I don't know how to fully let go of the past." Daniel's gaze softened, and he leaned closer, his voice gentle. "You don't have to forget your past, Emily. You don't have to erase the pain. What matters is that you've learned from it. And what matters is that you're here now with me. We're building something real, something that's not based on the lies and the hurt of the past. We're starting fresh, and that's all we can do." Emily's heart swelled with emotion, but there was still a part of her that was hesitant, a part of her that wasn't sure she could open up fully. She had spent so many years protecting herself, building walls around her heart, that letting someone in felt like a risk she wasn't sure she was ready to take. She had never allowed herself to love freely, to trust without hesitation, because she feared it would all fall apart once again. "I'm trying, Daniel. I really am," she said softly, her voice trembling with vulnerability. "But I don't know if I can ever be the person you want me to be. I'm afraid I'll always be broken, always carrying this weight with me." Daniel didn't flinch or pull away. Instead, he took a deep breath and gave her a look that made her heart ache with tenderness. "I don't want you to be anyone other than who you are, Emily. I'm not asking you to be perfect. I'm asking you to be real, to be you. You don't have to be healed to be loved. You just have to let me love you, flaws and all." Emily's eyes filled with tears, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of relief, of finally hearing the words she had always longed to hear. For so long, she had been trying to be someone she wasn't, trying to please people who would never truly love her. She had spent so much time seeking validation from others, trying to make up for the emptiness inside her. But Daniel wasn't asking her to be perfect. He wasn't asking her to prove her worth. He was offering her something she had never had before: unconditional love, love that was patient, kind, and understanding. For the first time in a long time, Emily felt a glimmer of hope. She could feel the walls inside her crumbling, piece by piece. She didn't need to be healed to be worthy of love. She didn't need to be whole to be enough. She had been enough all along. I don't want to lose you, Daniel, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. But I don't know if I can fully give myself to you. I don't know if I can trust again. Daniel smiled softly, his eyes filled with compassion. You don't have to trust completely right away, Emily. Trust takes time. But I'm not going anywhere. I'll be here, every step of the way. As they sat there together, their hands still intertwined, Emily felt a shift within herself. She had spent so long fearing love, fearing vulnerability, fearing that she would never be enough. But now, she realized that love wasn't about being perfect. It was about being seen, being heard, and being accepted for who you truly were. And for the first time, she was ready to embrace that truth. She wasn't broken. She was healing. And as she looked into Daniel's eyes, she knew that this was just the beginning of something beautiful. She wasn't defined by her past, and she wasn't limited by the pain she had carried for so long. She was strong enough to move forward, to love and be loved, without the fear of falling into the same traps of the past. It wasn't easy, and the road ahead would still have its challenges. But Emily was no longer afraid. She had the strength to face whatever came next, knowing that she was worthy of love, that she was worthy of happiness, and that the future she had dreamed of was finally within her reach. Months passed, and Emily's life began to take on a rhythm that felt more like a melody, a soft, gentle hum of everyday moments that weren't marred by fear or pain. She had found peace in herself. It was the kind of peace she had never thought possible, especially after everything that had happened with Edward. But in the quiet spaces between her days, Emily had learned to embrace the woman she had become. She had learned that healing didn't happen overnight, and that it was okay to move at her own pace. She wasn't in a rush to fix herself. She was focused on living, on loving, on being. Daniel had remained her rock, never rushing her to be anything other than what she was. His love wasn't perfect, it never had been, but it was real. Through his love, Emily had begun to understand that she didn't need to be whole to be loved, and that trust was built slowly, not forced. The mistakes of her past had taught her the importance of self-respect, of learning what she needed and wanted in a relationship, and how to stand firm in her boundaries. But there was still a part of Emily that struggled. As her relationship with Daniel deepened, so did her awareness of her past wounds. The old insecurities sometimes resurfaced in quiet moments, and there were days when she questioned if she was enough. The past had a way of creeping back into her mind, whispering doubts that she had long buried. One evening, as she and Daniel sat together in their cozy apartment, Emily's thoughts wandered to something that had been gnawing at her for a while. She had never fully addressed the way Edward's rejection had shaped her belief in herself. The pain of being used, manipulated, and abandoned by him had left a scar on her heart. It wasn't just about what Edward had done to her. It was about how she had allowed herself to fall so completely for someone who never truly saw her. Daniel noticed her distant gaze and placed his hand gently on her arm. "Hey, what's going on in that beautiful head of yours?" he asked, his voice warm, as if he could already sense the turmoil brewing within her. Emily sighed, the weight of her thoughts pressing down on her. "Sometimes, I wonder if I'll ever be able to stop feeling like I'm not enough," she admitted quietly. "I spent so many years trying to be what Edward wanted me to be, and in the end, I still wasn't good enough for him. And now, even though I know I'm loved, I can't shake the feeling that there's always something more I should be doing, something more I should be." Daniel's expression softened, his eyes full of understanding. He gently lifted her chin so that their eyes met. "Emily, you don't need to do anything. You already are enough. You're more than enough, just as you are. I love you for everything you've been, and everything you're becoming." Tears welled up in Emily's eyes as his words pierced through the walls she had built around her heart. The truth was, she had never believed she was enough. She had spent so much time trying to prove her worth to Edward and others that she had forgotten to prove it to herself. But Daniel's words, simple and sincere, were like a balm to the raw places within her. She didn't need to keep proving herself to anyone. She didn't need to try to be someone else. She was enough as she was. Her heart swelled as she looked at him, and for the first time in a long time, she let herself believe it. She didn't have to be perfect. She didn't have to be anyone other than who she truly was. The woman she was becoming was enough.
She could see that now.
In the days that followed, Emily began to notice subtle shifts in her own behavior. She wasn't just accepting herself more, she was embracing herself. It was as if a veil had been lifted, and the world around her seemed brighter. She started dressing in ways that made her feel confident, not for anyone else, but for herself. She spent time nurturing her own passions and hobbies, things she had put aside during her years with Edward. And in her interactions with Daniel, she began to trust fully, without fear or hesitation. She no longer doubted that she was worthy of love and care. One evening, as Emily sat with Daniel, reminiscing about their journey together, something inside her clicked. She realized that all the love, all the respect, and all the happiness she had been seeking wasn't something to chase after or fight for. It was something to receive. She had spent so much of her life trying to earn affection, trying to be what others wanted, that she had forgotten the most important thing, that she was already worthy of everything she wanted. For a long time, Emily's self-worth had been tied to someone else's opinion of her. Edward had shaped her perception of herself, and it had taken a long time to untangle the mess of insecurity and self-doubt he had left behind. But now she understood. She had learned that her worth was inherent, not conditional. She didn't need to prove anything to anyone. It was then that she realized how powerful this shift had been, not just in her relationship with Daniel, but in every area of her life. She wasn't just loved because of the way she looked or how much she gave to others. She was loved because of who she was. And when she began to fully embrace that truth, everything in her life started to shift in ways she couldn't have imagined before. But even as Emily blossomed into the woman she had always wanted to be, there was still a lingering feeling deep inside her, one that tied back to the scars of her past. How could she have fallen for someone like Edward? How could she have been so blind to his manipulations, his cruelty, and his lies? The truth was that Edward had conditioned her to believe that love had to be earned, that she had to jump through hoops and prove herself worthy of affection. She had spent years trying to fit into a mold that wasn't her own. And for a long time, it had seemed like she would never escape that cycle. But as Emily thought about her past, she realized that everything she had gone through had ultimately led her to this moment of self-discovery. Without the pain, without the heartache, she wouldn't have known the value of her own worth. And though she would never forget what she had endured, she could now forgive herself for it. She had learned the most important lesson of all, that love wasn't about earning someone's affection. It was about being yourself, being authentic, and allowing yourself to be loved as you were. And as Emily embraced this new chapter in her life, she realized that the lesson she had learned could apply to every woman out there, whether they had been through heartbreak, rejection, or abandonment. No one had to settle for less than they deserved. No one had to change who they were to be loved. The secret to attracting the love you wanted, one that was deep, lasting, and filled with respect, was about owning your worth, without apology. Just as Emily had rediscovered her self-worth, she knew that every woman had the power to unlock that same potential. There's a secret, something few know, that could turn any relationship around and make any man absolutely obsessed. It's a subtle, yet powerful trick that's been hidden for too long. If you're tired of feeling overlooked or rejected, it's time to learn how to make him fall for you, no matter your past or current situation. If you're ready to take control of your love life and attract the man who deserves you, click the link in the description or point to the QR code on the screen. You deserve a love that's as strong as your heart. Don't wait.